Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Tower of Nerek by David Guymer, narrated by Shoales. Chapter 1. Trenlo the Strong. Trenlo hated running. He was too heavy for it, in armor or out, and he had no technique. There were few creatures in Terrinoth that were stupid enough to chase Trenlo, and he had never been the sort to run after someone who had already given up on the fight. When Trenlo ran, it was like a warhorse trying to get up a flight of stairs. "Slow down, by Keros!" His armor clattered as he thundered down the narrow alley, arms and legs heaving up and down as though he was milling flour on a stone. "I'm not going to hurt you." He staggered on another 10 yards before collapsing, red-faced and gasping, against the dark timber frontage of the nearest house. The wood was so old it felt like bone. Thin ice from the morning damp tinkled onto the muddy lane. He gulped on a breath. The ripe, unfamiliar odors of people, wood smoke, and open sewers made him regret it. He coughed it back up. "All I want is—" He looked up, watching as his coin purse and the small girl who was currently holding onto it disappeared down yet another unmarked alley. Trenlo pushed himself up off the wall with a groan. "My purse back." Give him another demon lord to battle, or a horde of Uthakalan to hold across a ford. Anything but more running. With a resigned growl, he shook the sweat off his forehead and half ran, half stumbled after her into the alley. Somewhere over Nerek Hall, the sun was shining. Trenlo had glimpsed it briefly for himself when the guards had opened the South Kaelin Bridge to traffic from the east roads. Whatever had become of it since, it didn't shine here. The buildings held each other close like partners in crime. Upper stories bowed over the alleys, their roofs practically touching. Washing lines threaded the occasional gaps between the overhanging jetties, as though the only thing keeping the gloomy hovels upright was each other. Given the lingering chill of late snowmelt and the continuing absence of sun, drying laundry had given way to thousands upon thousands of raucous city pigeons. The birds perched on the lines, pecking at the moths fluttering around the jaundiced glow from the city's ubiquitous yellow lamps. In spite of the hour, the narrow lanes were already full. Townsfolk in purples, blacks, and grays blended anonymously into the dark woods and deep shadows of the street. Whispering groups of them stood in close huddles over the broken cobblestones to gossip about the war in the east, the latest guild scandal or unexplained disappearance. Children, cooped up within the long nighttime of winter's final months, ran and screamed down the alley. Trenlo's own accursed runaway slipped through them all like a mouse across a tap room full of legs. He struggled to keep her in sight. "Excuse me, miss." Without breaking stride, he scooped up an elderly lady who had chosen that moment to cross a street. His hand swallowed her stooped shoulders, immense biceps bulging as he deposited her as politely as possible on the opposite curb. "Make way." A circle of older children was gathered around an oxbow in the gutter channel, fishing in the scummy water. They didn't move, and Trenlo was forced into a swerve to avoid trampling them. "Coming through." Two men carrying shoulder bags jangling with tools walked slowly ahead of him, dragging their feet as they argued about an unpaid debt to the river bailiff. "Begging your pardon, sirs," he said, turning himself side on and barging between them. "Oi!" one of them yelled after him, but Trenlo was already through and several yards down the street, and by then neither man, having had a proper look and a moment to consider, felt like pursuing the grievance any further. The girl was just ahead. She threw a sharp look over the shoulder, yelped at the sight of Trenlo the Strong bearing down in full armor, and veered into another branch in the alley. Nerek Hall was a maze of them, a sunless warren of winding alleys, blind ends, double backs, and crooked little lanes that got a person nowhere except lost. Trenlo had always had a terrible sense of direction. His father had despaired of it. But Nerek Hall was something else. He had seen only one straight path in the entire city, and that had been the road going in. He chased the girl onto the branch, only to pull up when he found himself confronted by an unassailable wall of bustle. Several of the crooked houses were fronted by simple awnings in a variety of drab, sooty colors. The smell of baked loaves and barbecued meats filled the air, seeking to dislodge the less savory urban scents and not entirely succeeding. Men and women pushed carts and set up stalls, shooed stray urchins from their porch steps and hawked homespun wares. Blowing steam into the cold air, Trenlo planted his hands on his hips and surveyed the unexpected crowd. A maze. There was no other word for Nerek Hall that fit. He had only meant to leave his companions, and deer and owl at Bridge Market for a moment or two while he found directions to the academy. Now he was going to have to pay a guide just to retrace his steps. Damn that girl. She was nowhere to be seen. Trenlow was not overly concerned about the money. He had made and given away more in a single day than he had just lost. The occasional clean bed or cooked meal notwithstanding, it was not as though he wanted for much. No, it was the fear of returning to Bridge Market and facing Indira Runehand's disapproval, having lost what was, after all, technically her money, that had kept him running across half of Nerek Hall. His friend terrified him the way no foe ever had. Has anyone seen a girl? He looked hopefully around the shoppers and traders, but wherever he turned, folk glanced quickly away. Nerek Hall, as Trenlow had been firmly informed by the black-masked captain of the watch before being admitted across the bridge, is a law-abiding city. It minded its own business, and it saw no evil. Anyone? A middle-aged woman in a short dress of tattered fustian, who was setting out homemade pottery on her windowsill, caught his eye. She pursed her lip briefly, then nodded towards a narrow lane that opened immediately across from her window. It was little more than a gap where two houses failed to fully meet, effectively hidden away by the clutter of street furniture. A maze. Trenlow would never even have noticed it was there. He turned to thank the woman, but she had already disappeared, drawing the shutters over her shop window. It saw no evil. Taking a deep breath, Trenlow crossed to the alley. It was so narrow he had to enter sideways. A pair of rats, fleeing the sound of metal armor scraping on old timber, scampered ahead, their panicked squeaks echoing from the high walls. They rose to 3 stories either side. The way ahead smelled of rotting trash and damp. Had the girl really gone this way? Could he have misinterpreted the potter's direction? Was there even a second alleyway she had been pointing to but which he had not seen? Or was everyone in Nerek Hall a crook, petty or otherwise, and it had simply been the woman's intention to throw him off a fellow thief's chase? He shook his head, firmly berating himself for the unworthy thought. He did not mean to look for the worst in others, but he had grown up with the same stories of benighted Nerek Hall as everyone, and they were difficult to look past. Nevertheless, he was still torn between turning back or trusting the woman and pressing on when a shaft of gray sunlight suddenly lit up the alley ahead. It was not coming from above, but rather from a door that had opened at the alley's blind end, backlighting and framing the girl who had just thrown it open. She was much younger than Trenlow had been expecting, no more than 10 years old, and strikingly, almost painfully thin. Her smock was undyed, the gray-brown color of sheep, her frightened face and dirty blonde hair streaked with mud. Trenlow felt a stab of guilt. He was almost ready to give up the chase and let the poor girl have his coin.
Fortuna's luck, the girl spat. What does it take to get rid of you?
She slipped through the open door and pulled it shut behind her. Trenlow sighed and scraped doggedly along the tight passage. A few seconds behind the girl, he made it to the door. He tried the latch. The door rattled, bolted from the other side. He hated himself for it, but this girl was beginning to annoy him. Gods forgive me. This coin's supposed to be spent in a good cause. With absolutely no effort on his part, he threw his shoulder through the door. It crashed under the neat, yellow-stained flagstones that lay on the other side, and Trenlow blinked as he staggered through into the unexpected brilliance of direct sunlight. He had been expecting the back room of some pickpocket's den, but found himself instead in what appeared to be a narrow backyard. A-shaped wooden frames filled the available space between the walls. Sheepskins, apparently intended for book bindings judging by their size and shape, were stretched taut across them, creaking contentedly as they cured in the dim sunlight. A dwarf in a stiff leather apron and gloves turned towards him, bloodshot eyes peering out over a thick woolen mask. "Girl," Trenlow managed to pant out. The dwarf raised a bushy eyebrow and glanced pointedly towards the door lying on the ground at Trenlow's feet. "I'll pay for that," Trenlow added, reaching instinctively for the coin purse at his belt, before remembering where it had gone. "I'll owe you, I promise. You can find me at the Iron Brick Inn. Ask for Indira Runehand." The dwarf appeared to scowl, though it was difficult to be completely certain through the layers of protective clothing, and jabbed a thumb over his shoulder towards the building behind him. "Thank you," Trenlow said, but the dwarf had gone back to work as if the giant in his yard had already left. Trenlow was halfway towards the tannery when a scream pierced the cold air. He halted mid-stride, head turning towards the sound as it bounced confusingly around the jumble of garrets, gables, and walls. It sounded as though it had come from the next yard over. He threw another look towards the tannery, indecisive only for the time it took him to turn away and size up the yard's stone wall. He would make up the lost coin to Indira somehow. Some things were more important than gold. The dwarf, he noticed, was studiously getting on with his work, refusing even to look up as a second scream rang out from the other side of the wall. Trenlow would never understand this city. He didn't even feel guilty this time as he punched through the wall. The old dry stone gave before his fists as it might have done to a battering ram. 2 more punches and a shoulder charge and he was through, coughing on stone dust and taking in the even smaller, even grayer yard that lay on the other side. It was a garden. A thin trickle of sunlight fell through the overhanging eaves, enough to keep a wall of scrambling holly, a few scrags of fruiting mistletoe, and several clay pots of young tomatoes alive and green. Postern doorways and derelict wooden stairs tumbled towards it from a number of neighboring buildings, including, Trenlow noticed, the one he had just left behind. And true enough, there was his thief. She must have entered the tannery and then doubled back down the outside stair to the adjoining garden to throw him off. If she hadn't stopped and cried out, Trenlow would never have caught her. She was buried to her shoulders in mistletoe, and Deer's perch clutched to her chest as though it was Fortuna's talisman, and staring not at Trenlow, but at what appeared to be a suit of armor standing on the opposite side of the small yard. It was 7 feet tall, more massive even than Trenlow, and in black iron from the crest of its great helm to the toes of its boots. In its left hand it was holding a rune-embossed shield. In its right, a monstrous glaive. A tabard bearing the purple and black bicolor flag of Nerek hung from its groin. The limp cloth bore a white heraldic rune that Trenlow didn't recognize. It was one of the Ironbound. There had been one accompanying the guards on the South Caeln Bridge, but that one had not moved. With a grinding of gears, the suit's great helm clanked around until it was staring at Trenlow. There was no visor, no slits for eyes. Its face was a smooth plate of black iron patterned with gold. And yet Trenlow felt the full weight of its attention on him. A sound like that of a sniffing hound echoed up from the hollow prison of its helm, and Trenlow felt a shiver run through him. His every sense rejected the thing in front of him. Unalive, and yet apparently aware. Cold, and yet profoundly malign. Trenlow had seen at close quarters the animus that the magisters of Greyhaven had sent east to fight alongside the barony of Kell against the Uthuk Alan. They had been inert lumps of stone, lent a crude and temporary life at their master's command. But this... It sniffed again, as though to make certain of something, and whatever it smelled was evidently not to its liking. Hot steam whistled out through the joints of its armor, and runes began to glow. Its helmet clanked sharply back towards the girl cowering in the mistletoe, who took a deep breath and screamed again, and Trenlow did what he was famous for. He acted without thinking. His fist, still gray with dust from punching through the wall, smashed through the thing's face. The helmet gave a hollow clang, twisting a quarter turn to the side, but the armor didn't so much as stumble. Trenlow, meanwhile, roared in pain, drawing his bruised knuckles to his chest. It was like punching an anvil. The Ironbound's return blow came while he was still reeling from the shock, a steel crumpling backhand that sent Trenlow crashing through the wall and back into the tanner's yard. He coughed, face buried in the dusting rubble, and immediately needed to cough again. "Walk it off, Trenlow," his father had always used to say to him when he was down. "You're a big lad, so on your feet and walk it off." Unshipping his shield from his back, he planted its pointed base into the crack between 2 stones and propped his chest up off the ground. He hung his head in near despair as the Ironbound stomped through what was left of the wall. It said nothing. It made no sound but for the grating of heavy armor and the tick, tick, tick of hidden gears. It was not quick, but it came on with a relentless indefatigability that was exhausting just to watch. At least it was coming for him now instead of the girl. From somewhere deep inside, he found the strength to curl his injured fingers around the handle of his axe and draw it from his belt. From behind the advancing armor's back, he saw the girl's pale face peeking through the hole in the wall. "Run!" Trenlow hissed as the Ironbound built up a head of steam, smashing the flagstones between it and Trenlow under its heavy iron boots. It drew back its shield to strike. Trenlow's voice rose to become a yell. "Find Undina Runehand at Bridge Market and tell her—" He never finished. The armor issued a shuddering metallic howl. Iron pushed to its breaking point, and its heavy shield stove into the side of Trenlow's head. Trenlow hit the ground and fell silent.